My main reason for not being an atheist, of course, as a Christian, I'm not an atheist, but my main intellectual reason is that I cannot accept a view that destroys the very rationality that's required to have this discussion.
On today's episode, we're looking with Professor John Lennox at the issue of science. Can a believer be a scientist? Can a scientist be a believer? Surely Genesis 1 stands as a roadblock to faith. Well, Professor John Lennox is in a unique position to be able to answer those questions. He is Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at Oxford University, and he has famously debated many of the leading lights of the new atheism. And yet, last year, John Lennox had a dialogue with Dave Rubin, who is a leading light in what's been dubbed the intellectual dark web. And Dave Rubin represents a very different kind of non-Christian. Someone who is increasingly open to religion, increasingly open to what faith might contribute to modern conversations. And I began my conversation with John Lennox by asking him, does that shift from the likes of a Richard Dawkins to the likes of a Dave Rubin, does that represent something more broadly in the culture?
I suspect there is a shift, although it's very hard to extrapolate from one experience. Although the discussion with Dave Rubin was very remarkable to my mind, and the moderator, Justin Brierley, and I both felt that his openness was quite staggering and, in a way, a lesson to us all. And you see someone there who's moved from a position fairly well on the left of thinking, becoming more and more conservative and opening his mind to the possibility that, yes, the God hypothesis might make a lot more sense than he had hitherto thought. So that is encouraging. What I do find is that people are up for this kind of discussion. Until lockdown, I was very frequently addressing audiences of well into the thousands, and young people. The interest in this huge question is still with us. And there are two big questions that I have thought about most of my life. First of all, what's the status of the universe? Is it created or not? And what's the status of human life? Is it made in the image of God or not? And it seems to me those are two poles that frame a lot of the discussion.
Yes, yeah, and that really gels with what we want to look at in terms of Genesis chapter 1. I mean, Genesis chapter 1 is often thought of as a barrier to belief. There might be all sorts of people who can get along okay with the idea that Christianity is metaphorically true, but the metaphysical truth claims they really stumble at. And so even addressing those truth claims from Genesis chapter 1 becomes a stumbling block for them. What would you say, first of all, to somebody who feels that science and faith are irreconcilable enemies?
Well, I would say, first of all, that science depends crucially on faith. If you're using faith, and here comes the hook in this, science and faith are often opposed, but what do we mean by faith? If we mean religion, well, then we better say so, because if you mean faith in the subjective sense, that is my belief, then science is crucially dependent on that. And for example, Einstein said famously that he could not imagine a scientist without that faith. Now, he didn't mean faith in God. He meant faith in the fact, well, putting it simply, that you can do science. Putting it in a slightly more complex way, he meant faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. And every scientist has got to believe that before they start. And I think it's hugely important to put this right, because otherwise you have people constantly talking about an opposition between science and faith, when really what they mean is an opposition between science and the particular religion they're talking about. The ambiguity in the word faith is something that needs to be cleared at the beginning, because belief systems, science involves belief every bit as much as Christianity. And I would go a lot further than that to say science prides itself on an evidence-based faith. Christianity does exactly the same. It's evidence-based. And the Christian claims are testable. So that I see a strong analogy between the way in which we approach science rationally and the way in which we approach Christianity and the Bible rationally. So the first thing I would clear up is this science-faith dichotomy. But when it comes to Genesis 1, this idea that Christianity can be understood metaphorically, again, covers a lot of confusion, because metaphor, of course, is usually used, often, in fact, always used to describe something real. So if you're saying Christianity is metaphorical, well, what is it a metaphor for? Now, coming to Genesis 1, it's easy, I think, to point out that its initial statement, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is not a metaphor for anything. It's a metaphor for itself. In other words, it's talking about exactly the same heavens and earth that physicists and cosmologists study. It's a claim about factually existing things, that is, if we believe they exist at all. And it's a very important statement because it has been substantiated by contemporary science when for thousands of years, Aristotle's view that the universe did not have a beginning held sway. And the irony of all of this is that I was alive in the 1960s, and you can believe that quite easily looking at me. And I recall when the evidence for a beginning in the finite past to space-time was being advanced in the name of science. And it was fiercely resisted in the UK. And the pages of Nature carried an editorial by John Lennox, I think his name was, resisting this and basically saying, look, it's a bit risky to go down this road and we shouldn't do it because it'll give too much leverage to people who believe the Bible. In other words, the most powerful, probably one of the most powerful scientific advances in the 20th century was being resisted because it appeared to be confirming the Bible. So when we come to Genesis 1, I want to put my foot down very strongly here and say, look, this is an amazing situation. Now, I know that when I debated Dawkins on this one, he said, no big deal. Either the universe had a beginning or not, so there's a 50-50 chance. So the Bible got it right. Well, I said, at least it got it right. And in any case, the matter was not decided by statistics. It took extremely powerful scientific arguments to establish the fact that space-time had a beginning. I can, if you like, tell you a little story that illustrates the state of affairs. I was invited to a very prestigious gathering of scientists, philosophers, and various other people. And I was not quite the only Christian there, but I had to represent the God side of things as a scientist. And I talked about Genesis 1, and I was interrupted. And a physicist, a very well-known physicist, said, Professor Lennox, please tell us you were joking when you claimed that the Bible had something to say to us in the 21st century. I said, I wasn't joking. I said, of course, the Bible is by definition pre-modern science, but the universe it's talking about is the same one as you study. And may I make a suggestion? It's not all that useless, because if it had been taken more seriously earlier, you could have easily made a prediction based on it. And that is, the Bible claims there was a beginning. Now, instead of thinking Aristotelian thoughts, you had said, let's give this hypothesis a chance. Is there any evidence that we can discover that indicates there was a beginning? I said, just maybe you'd have got to the Standard Model earlier than you did. Dead silence. The point is, many people say, well, the Bible's useless from the perspective of science because you can make no prediction based on it. That's entirely wrong, as I've just stated, when it comes to the beginning. It's very important, just as a last point, to indicate that, of course, the Bible isn't a textbook of science. I don't teach cosmology or algebra from Leviticus. But the point is, Scripture has something to say about the very same universe that scientists study. And what it says is extremely important, even though it is not very much. And we can get into that if you like.
Yes. So, I mean, you said to this this other scientist, if you had taken Genesis 1 more seriously, is there a sense in which actually perhaps we in the church needed to have taken Genesis 1 a bit more seriously?
Oh, I think that's absolutely so. That the difficulty is, you said earlier, that Genesis has been a barrier. Now, the reason for that, of course, when it comes to the church, that is in much more recent times, is the fact that many people look at it and they see the sequence of days and they say that's absolutely absurd because we know the earth is old, and they simply ridicule it without beginning even to say, well, now look, are we reading it correctly? Are we understanding it correctly? And the sad thing to my mind is that something like the age of the earth can be cleared up in 2 minutes if you know a little bit about Hebrew grammar of Genesis 1. And the irony is, I don't know whether you want me to mention that, do you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. So
Well,
perhaps if I, yeah. So, I mean, in Genesis chapter 1, we've got, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Verse 3, and God said, and of course the days begin with, and God said. And then the days are numbered in various ways. And when you press into the Hebrew, you find some very interesting features.
Oh, you do indeed. And I've written about them, as you may know, in my book, 7 Days That Divide the World. Simply put, we see a sequence of speech acts. And that is fascinating. And God said, because that resonates with the first statement in the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word. And I think that is an immensely important insight, that this is a word-based universe. To put it another way, information is fundamental. Now, it's only recently that physicists have decided that information is a fundamental quantity, and many of them now believe it is not reducible to physics and chemistry. So that, if you like to put it in a biblical form, word is primary. And as John's Gospel tell you, all things came to exist, which is what the Greek says at that point, through the word. It's word primary, mass energy derivative, which was a suggestion made some time ago by a famous physicist called Wheeler and has been picked up by a number of other people. I'm writing about that at the moment to upgrade my book, God's Undertaker, in fact. So the first thing is we notice a sequence of speech acts that starts and finishes. And as you say, each of the days starts with, and God said. But the book doesn't start with, and God said. The book starts with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it has been pointed out by Hebrew scholars that the first 2 verses are written in one past tense and the sequence of days in another past tense. And I can only go on what they tell me. And Jack Collins, for example, points out that the tense used in the beginning of the book is placing it as at an indefinite period of time before the sequence of days. Well, if the time of the beginning is at an indefinite period before the sequence of days, then there need be no argument about the age of the earth. We've no idea from the Bible what it is. And the irony of that is simply this: no matter what you believe about the days, you still cannot argue a young earth from them. Now, the days themselves are fascinating because, as you say, the numbering is interesting. It's not the first, the second. Hebrew does have a definite article. That's used only on the 6th and the 7th. So it's day 1, day 2, day 3, etc. And there are various views of this. And I can go into some of them if you wish, but I would like to say from the beginning that you will meet equally godly and intelligent thinking believers who agree about every basic doctrine of Christianity. They agree with the fact of creation. They agree with the pre-existence of Christ, his life, death, miracles, resurrection, ascension, and second coming, but they don't agree on interpreting the days of Genesis. And there's been disagreement on those for thousands of years, not just for a few years since Darwin came along, not at all, for thousands of years. And the point is, when we see something like that happening, we need to be careful because there seems to be genuine room for disagreement. That makes life interesting. But the sad thing is, to my mind, that Christians some fight each other over this, and they just make themselves a laughingstock to the world. I think this is an area where we can have a space for disagreement. And I've tried in as peaceful a way as I can in my book, 7 Days, to indicate what some of the possibilities are and to just say, be careful. We can't be over dogmatic. The most obvious one is, of course, the seventh day is not given an ending. And most thinking Christians with any kind of theological knowledge think that the seventh day is still going on. So there's at least one very long day. So
That's right.
It's a complex matter.
Yes.
And it is a sad scandal for Christians to be fighting about it. Let me emphasize this. The central staggering claim of Genesis 1 is the fact of creation. The how of it and the timing of it are very much secondary issues. And this seems to be generally accepted. The rise of modern science comes from the belief that it is a creation. The pioneers, Galileo, Newton, Kepler, Clerk Maxwell, all of them were believers in God. And I agree very much with C.S. Lewis, who said that men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, I'm not ashamed of being a scientist and a Christian believer in the Genesis account, because it was that account, arguably, that gave me my subject.
Right. Right. Yeah. I often put it that to get science off the ground, you need laws up above, you need minds in here, and you need a world out there.
That's absolutely right.
And you need those three to triangulate. And what an extraordinary thing it is that those three things triangulate. As Einstein said, the great mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. Why should there be rationally comprehensible laws? Why should this, 3 pounds of grey matter have any access to the mysteries of the cosmos? And why should the empirical method kind of triangulate with the laws up above and my mind in here? Whereas I come to Genesis, and we come along to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and we have every reason in the world to believe in rational minds that might have access to those deeper mysteries. So you get to Genesis 1, verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And again, he reiterates in verse 28, rule over the fish of the sea, rule over this creation. So what help do those verses in particular give to us if we want to pursue science?
They give us enormous dignity to start with. You see, the created world, Genesis and the rest of Scripture, are very careful. The created world of nature shows God's glory. The stars do, and I love watching them through my telescope. But they're not made in his image. only humans are. So that gives them infinite value and dignity. And I was very interested watching a lecture recently by Jordan Peterson on Genesis 1. And he was commenting on this man made in the image of God. And he said, man, he sort of stopped and hesitated. He said, man, this is the cornerstone of civilization. We neglect it at our peril. And human values, human dignity, human rights, all of that flow from that statement that God made human being in his own image. And as far as science is concerned, you really need to move a chapter forwards where God told the first humans to name the animals. And taxonomy is the fundamental, not only biological discipline. God actually got biology going. He didn't say, I'm going to do it for you, you do it. But taxonomy is the fundamental intellectual discipline, naming things in all kinds of fields and areas. And it was God said, you do it. In other words, Genesis is highly pro-science. And Genesis 2 encourages exploration of the world, follow the rivers and see where they lead and develop the minerals there and all this kind of stuff. Well, that's research and exploration and everything else. And again, God encouraged it. So we have a real mandate for science. So it's no wonder that James Clerk Maxwell put on the doorway of the Cavendish Laboratory, the most famous lab in the world in Cambridge, the verse from Psalm 110, Psalm 100 and whatever it is, 5. Great are the works of the Lord, searched out by all those who delight in them. These people, these massive intellectual pioneers of science, saw a unity between the biblical worldview and the scientific worldview, and they didn't see the two as competing, because science was generally finding out how things worked and what they were, whereas the Bible did mention some of those things, but concentrate on the why of purpose. Why does the whole thing exist at all? And you need those two kinds of answers to give you a comprehensive picture.
Right. I've heard you say before that there's a great difference between discovering a mechanism and exploring meaning. Can you sort of tease that apart for us? What's the difference between a mechanism and the realms of meaning and maker?
Well, there's a whole room, I believe, in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington full of mechanisms. Anybody can see they're designed, but nobody has a clue what they're for. Nobody has a clue what their purpose and their meaning is. Now, a simple illustration is better than 1,000 words here. And I often illustrate it by saying, why is the water boiling? And the first answer is it's boiling because of a heat exchange, and increased heat from a gas flame is agitating the molecules of water, and that's why it's boiling. But I could say it's boiling because I want a cup of tea. And that's now bringing meaning into it, in the sense that I have a desire for a cup of tea and I'll be satisfied if I get one. That's an agent reason, whereas the other is in terms of a law or terms of a mechanism. And they complement, they don't compete. It would be utterly foolish to say that they were in conflict with one another. Just different kinds of explanation. And of course, the cup of tea explanation is, outside science, by far the most important one in terms of my desire and what would be meaningful to me. And what we need to realize, and I think many scientists don't realize this, and also many Christians, is that explanations come at different levels. And we need to realize that there are complementary levels. And so science, properly understood, and Christianity, properly understood, don't conflict in that sense at all.
Yeah, I often give the illustration of Betty the botanist. Gareth the lab assistant comes in, and Betty says, "Thank you so much for giving me the botanical specimen that you gave me yesterday. I've run all sorts of spectral analyses. I've mapped the genome of the specimen, and I think it's going to be a breakthrough in botany." And Gareth says, "What are you talking about, Betty? It was a long stem rose. It was Valentine's Day. Do you understand what I gave to you, Betty?" And
Yes.
On one level, does she understand the rose? Yes. On another level, no. Betty is a moron.
Yeah, well, that's an equally good example, and it's important, I think, to like Jesus taught parables, to use these things as parables to get across to people what the nature of explanation is, because a lot of the conflicts, I think, can be avoided, at least initially, if we realize really what questions are we trying to ask and what are we trying to answer.
Yes, yes. Let's press into the imago Dei, sort of the Latin phrase for the image of God.
Sure.
What would happen, or what is happening, in let's narrow it to the scientific community. What happens when we walk away from that truth of the special dignity of humanity? What happens to your ability to explore the world?
Well, I think what happens is what we've seen in history, tragically, mainly in the 20th century. You get the blood of hundreds of millions running when you lose the concept of the value of the individual as made in the image of God. Think of the collectivization in Russia and Ukraine that was forced by Stalin. Horrific. And you see, the interesting thing there is that the notion of the individual as made in the image of God was replaced by a notion not very clearly defined of equality. And then that was forced upon people. And therefore, it was used in a utilitarian way to militate against minorities. And so hundreds of thousands and millions of people died. And I think that's what Peterson meant by saying this is a cornerstone of civilization, that we need to recover this. Now, collectives are important, the family is important, the business is important, the company, the university, the institution. But the moment we lose that vertical dimension, the relationship with God, the fact that we bear his image, then from a scientific perspective, and we're the first generation to see the possibility of this, is that we start to mess about with humans 1.0 and try to bioengineer them. And therefore we get atheist people, mainly like Yuval Noah Harari, arguing, right, we've passed the animal stage, we've got to the Homo sapiens stage, but we're not going to stop there. We're going to take it now into our own hands and modify human beings, and we're going to turn Homo sapiens into Homo Deus, hence the name of his multi-million best-selling book. And that, to my mind, represents a very dangerous path. And I noticed that a number of people who have no truck with Christianity at all, as far as I know, are very concerned about the ethical implications of it, because we risk destroying human beings. And that's where I would bring C.S. Lewis in, and the importance of two of his books, The Abolition of Man and That Hideous Strength, where he pointed out that if human beings ever get into the position of, say, modifying the germline and thus affecting the nature of all human beings to come, that what they will create is not human beings, but artifacts. And he's got this chilling statement. I think it is the last triumph of science will be the abolition of man. And we need to take heed to that, which is why I've recently written a book, 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity. And it's from the base of Imago Dei that I would want to approach the seriousness of this kind of development.
Yes, yes. I was going to get onto that book. As we explore areas of artificial intelligence, it seems very important to figure out what we believe about Genesis 1:26, whether we believe there's some kind of human exceptionalism, what we believe about human consciousness and that sort of thing, because the materialistic view tends towards the view that the human brain is a very sophisticated computer, and as long as you get the computational sophistication to a certain degree, then that is the equivalent of the human mind or soul, or what we've been, thinking of as the human person up until now. The Christian has a defense against that, to say, no, there is something very exceptional about the human person, and there is this category called soul, whereas the materialist doesn't have that. What are the dangers of the purely materialistic view of things?
Well, the dangers are huge. First of all, it dehumanizes people. You use the analogy computer. If my computer breaks, I can scrap it, buy a new one. And that view of human beings has been held. It was very evident in East Germany. I used to go there a great deal during the Cold War, and people were working units. And once they broke down, they were shoved across the border if possible, so the state didn't have to look after their pension. And that idea of the worker's paradise really comes from this kind of thinking. So it's a very risky business. But the mind and the brain, this idea you are your brain or your mind is the brain, that cannot be true. Now, of course, millions of words have been written about it. I've written about it myself. But the most obvious thing to me is that if you put some instrumentation on my head, you can tell me what's in my brain in the sense of electrical impulses and what part of the brain lights up when you stimulate it. You can't tell me what's in my mind. I can't tell what's in my brain, but I can tell you what's in my mind. And the point is that the pressure to accept a reductionist view that the mind is the brain, of course, comes from the fact that mental events are not material. And I think we need to face that. Now, when it comes to Genesis 1 and John 1, in the beginning was the Word, information is not material either. So materialism for me has got very little traction, since it seems to be science itself disproves it. And finally, that if you reduce the mind to the brain, then, as my teacher of quantum physics, John Polkinghorne, has pointed out many times, thought just becomes a neural event. And he says, none of us believe it. It cannot be so, because that argument, taken to its logical conclusion, destroys rationality. And I frequently have fun with some of my scientific colleagues, and I ask them, what do you do science with? And they point to their head and say and they nearly say mind, but then they say brain if it's not politically correct. And I say, okay, tell me the brief history of the brain then. And they say, well, the brain is essentially the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I say, and you trust it? Tell me honestly, if you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? Now, I always force an answer to that. And I've always had the answer, no, I would not. Well, then I say, you've got a problem then, haven't you? That you're espousing a philosophy of mind and brain that destroys rationality and therefore destroys science.
Yes. Tease that out for us, because I do think that Alvin Plantinga, for instance, has made this kind of argument very powerfully.
He has. C.S. Lewis started it a long time ago, and he made that point that we've done a lot of thinking, but we haven't thought about thinking. And any view, any theory that invalidates thinking cannot be true, because you reach it by thinking. And Plantinga has taken this up. More interestingly, in a way, Plantinga is a genius, of course. He is a believer. And unfortunately, people will criticize him for that, even though his arguments stand. But Thomas Nagel is no believer. He's actually a hard atheist. He doesn't want there to be a God. And he's seen the point. He hasn't drawn its conclusions for himself, but he's seen the point that if uh, evolutionary naturalism argues that the mind is reducible to physics and chemistry, then it's effectively shooting itself not in the foot but in the brain. That's my analogy.
Yes, yes.
And he has a huge problem. And his book, Mind and Cosmos, I couldn't believe its subtitle when it came out. Why the neo-Darwinian view of the world is almost certainly false.
Almost certainly false. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the evidence for that has increased massively since he wrote that book. But all of those arguments, I think, are very substantive. That I often put it to people, look, my main reason for not being an atheist, of course, as a Christian, I'm not an atheist, but my main intellectual reason is that I cannot accept a view that destroys the very rationality that's required to have this discussion with you. And therefore, it seems to me that is a powerful argument. And I notice that many scientists just don't like it. They don't want to go there. And if you step back from it, you see the vivid contrast between the Christian worldview, which is in the beginning was the Word. The rationality comes from God, it's top down. And the atheist view, which is bottom up, that says the rationality comes from mindless, unguided processes. And that leads to a pure self-contradiction. So it simply doesn't work. And referring to this image of God and human beings being special, I've often thought Christians particularly do not take seriously enough the claim that's at the very beginning of John's Gospel, that the Word became human. Because if anything demonstrates that human beings are special, it is that God became one.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And there you have the integration of the laws up above, minds in here and a world out there, in that the Logos, through whom all things were made, takes flesh so that we might join him in his kind of life. So
That's
if
exactly
human
right.
minds are destined to be able to have communion with the rational God, then it is no surprise that we have those capacities for rationality.
That's exactly right. And you see, the explanatory power of that view is paramount. And we need to point it out that it accords with all we know from experience and from science, the natural sciences, but not only those, from philosophy, logic, theology, and everything else. It's, in that sense, a clear no-brainer.
A minder instead, yeah. So what about the pushback, though? Because I say these sorts of things in conversations, and sometimes people say, well, the survival pressure on our evolution would require that our brains evolve to track reality at least approximately, at least well enough so that I survive and reproduce myself. Can we not trust, therefore, that if my brain has been evolved, yes, for survival, that there will be significant overlap between survival and truth, and therefore I can trust its truth-seeking validity?
I'm afraid I've read too much biology to even begin to buy that, because the neo-Darwinian synthesis on which that's based is becoming very rapidly old hat, There was a major meeting at the Royal Society last year, the year before, organized by Dennis Noble, FRS, who's a professor at Oxford here, and I know Dennis, and he's developing a field called systems biology. And their view, and he's with a number of very seriously gifted biologists, is not that the neo-Darwinian synthesis, or what's called the modern synthesis, needs enhancing or developing. It needs to be replaced. It just is not good enough. It can account for very little things. And when you say selection pressure will cause the increase in the brain, how? Where's the mechanism? Where's the evidence? Now, I'm a mathematician, not a biologist, but I read a massive amount of biology, and what that has done over the years is vastly increased my skepticism of these just so stories, that selection pressure will mean the brain will evolve and so on. But I'm afraid that appears to be disappearing. Systems biology is undermining some of the old Darwinian dogmas. It is putting various things in its place, which shows that living organisms are vastly more complicated than we thought. And their levels of sophistication, way beyond that of DNA, in epigenetics, that again, from my perspective, indicate even more that the most plausible explanation is the underlying cause is word, the input of a mind, and not anything like the little processes of mutation and selection, which certainly do something, but very little.
Yeah, yeah. Do you see another danger in undercutting the Imago Dei, in that are we perhaps becoming less and less interested in exploring the universe, less and less interested in, or less and less confident that there might be a grand unified theory of everything, less and less confidence that there might be a grand harmony to be explored? Because if we are just a part of the universe the same as every other part of the universe, I guess why should there be a grand rational explanation for all things? Do you think we're becoming less scientific, less curious, because we're walking away from this kind of doctrine of humanity?
Well, who's the we?
Mm-hmm.
We're becoming. Who's the we? Certainly many people are, and atheism is a rapidly growing belief system. And I emphasize that it is a belief system. And one of the biggest problems getting through to atheists is that they will accuse us of having faith, whereas atheists have no faith, as Dawkins says and Hitchens, and yet they write books on what they believe. I mean, it's absolute nonsense that they are reduced to. I think certainly there's been a lot of increase, particularly in Europe, and that has its roots partly in the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the evils of dissolute professing Christian church and all the rest of it. But I think also that there's a lot of interest in going in the other direction. Now, in terms of philosophy, of course, you have the postmodern trend that's been with us, of course, for thousands of years, but in its special sense of people being very leery about meta-narratives or overarching stories and all this kind of thing. That is true, but you see, the atheists, the people we've been talking about, these atheist biologists, they have a story. They're not postmodern, at least not in their science. They may be in their ethics and their philosophy, but they're not relativists in their science.
Perhaps in their gender politics as well, but yeah,
yes,
that's another conversation. Yeah,
that is another conversation. But they have a huge story that they feel is attractive to people. Life crawling out of the slime and eventually establishing itself and becoming intelligent and then being wiped out in the heat death of the universe and all of that. They have a story. Christians have a story. And all I want to say is, if only the media in our country would give more opportunity for Christians to put their story, because often there's huge media bias in many countries in favor of the naturalistic story. And so we need to get involved in there. But I find these generalized questions, are we moving, are we this? I find it impossible to answer because my data base for answering that kind of question is so relatively limited. I mean, it's almost down to reading in Zoom these days. I mean, the point is that I want to stick my neck out for a concept of truth and to inject what I believe to be truth into the public space for people to consider. But you're right, there is a danger. And part of that danger is caused by very ominous changes in public perception, political correctness, and all this kind of stuff, where people aren't allowed to have an opinion, and university students needing a safe space, and you've got a no platform, everybody that disagrees with you. Now that will destroy society. That's hugely dangerous. And it has the effect on the more nervous people of privatizing anything they'd want to say, whether it's Christian or not. And they become silent, and life becomes immensely boring. And therefore, a protection of freedom of speech a la Voltaire, I think, is important. I disagree with you, but I'll defend with my life your right to disagree with me publicly, but do it in a friendly fashion. We desperately need to get back to that.
Yes, I was almost tempted to say that in your area of mathematics, you're perhaps most protected from those sort of political shenanigans, and yet in the last month on Twitter there was a whole long trend of people saying yes, in some circumstances 2 + 2 can equal 5, and there are all sorts of political constructions that make
I
us
would
think it
just
equals
say
4.
don't give those people any job in a bank.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there are too many of them already in banks.
Yeah, that's right. And they've gotten quite wealthy off it. So let's just conclude by kind of summarizing a lot of what we've gained from Genesis 1. We've got a universe with a finite history in the past. We've got this contingent reality called creation, as distinct from anything else that's necessary, and that's hugely important for science. We've also got a humanity made in God's image and therefore able to understand something, perhaps, of the mysteries of the cosmos, and given actual direction to go and rule and have dominion over creation. Is there anything else you'd say from sort of Genesis 1 as really particularly benefiting us as wanting to pursue science?
Well, the fact, I've said this before, but the central thing is the fact of creation. But when it comes to the how, relatively little is said, except that it has to do with speech. Now, in the beginning was the word is a profound insight. And if you ask, could science profit from that? I think so. It has already profited from it. And I've noticed one or two people like Wheeler, the physicist I mentioned, actually quoting John 1. But it seems to me that you could revolutionize an approach by saying, look, when we do science, actually, in our work, we effectively are treating things as if they had been designed. Now, would it not be reasonable to say, well, look, let's just assume that they have been designed. That's why they appear to be designed. And see if we can make some advance by assuming that there is a mind behind the universe. Now, of course, I haven't mentioned this yet, but the whole matter you did, the matter of consciousness and what it is, gets us very rapidly, it seems to me, increasingly rapidly, into quantum mechanics. And we have to begin to ask, well, what exactly is this matter and what is its relationship to mind? Because I suspect that if we understood more about it, the very odd thing that I can think and that produces a physical reaction. In other words, my mind can move atoms. It might give us a much closer insight into the fact that God, who is spirit, mind, can create a physical world. And I would love to see science done on the basis of working along that kind of line. In other words, assuming the biblical worldview, but not prescribing what you've got to find out in your research, but doing it as if this was true.
Right. And once again, demonstrating that science and faith are not enemies, but can be the best of friends. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, Professor Lennox, your book 2084, is that out currently?
Oh, yes, sure. It's been out a couple of months. 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity with Zondervan. It's out on all forms, Audible, Kindle, and it can be obtained on Amazon.
Wonderful. Well, I do hope that many people check that out. But Professor Lennox, thank you so much for spending time with us.
My pleasure.